out. So tonight we're going to look at Malvina Hoffman's Column of Life. And here it is. Here they are, I should say, more appropriately. These are the two works. Both are in the museum's collection. One dates from 1917, the other from 1939. The one on the left is the one that dates from 1917, and the one on the right from 1939. These are both plaster, and they were, as we shall see, cast in bronze later. But part of the collection that we have, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, we have a wide variety of Hoffman's works. But the majority of what we have are plasters that were then used later to make bronze casts from. So the plaster was really where the idea was formed. And then when you cast in bronze, you use that plaster and you keep reusing that plaster every time you want to cast again in bronze. So, these are two works from a really illustrious career by Malvina Hoffman, who's not a household name, but she was Auguste Rodin's last student. Rodin, formidable French sculptor, was her instructor. She was the last student that he took on. He was quite advanced in age. He is a household name, but Hoffman today is not. She was better known during her lifetime. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. And here I'm sharing with you a picture of her. There are books written about Malvina Hoffman. She lived quite a full and rich life. There are books written by Malvina Hoffman, which I recommend to you because she was quite a good writer as well. But I'm going to share with you, I'm going to read to you just a little bit of a gallery guide that I wrote several years ago, in which we had Malvina Hoffman's work in the gallery with Rodin's work. And so it has a bit of her biography, and I won't read the whole thing to you, but it gives you a nice sort of background to her work. Characterized by some as America's Rodin, Malvina Hoffman, 1885 to 1966, was an important early 20th century sculptress whose work is an unknown treasure in the collection of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. She studied with French sculptor Auguste Rodin from between 1910 and 1914, and reached a level of international fame in the 1920s and 1930s. Who was this woman? How did she become a student to an aging master who hardly needed to take on another student? How did she earn the title of America's Rodin? The youngest of 5 children, Malvina Hoffman was born into a creative environment. Her father, Richard Hoffman, was a child prodigy pianist who came to the United States from Britain in 1847 at the age of 15. 3 years later, he joined Jenny Lind on her first concert tour of the U.S., arranged by P.T. Barnum, later of circus fame. Richard Hoffman soon became a popular piano teacher in New York City, which is where he met and married one of his students, Fidelia Lamson. After their elopement, they set up a home on West 43rd Street near Broadway. With 5 children and a limited income from teaching music, the Hoffman family lived quite modestly. The neighborhood provided endless entertainment for young Mally, who watched from the family apartment the comings and goings of people visiting music hall star Lillian Russell, who lived across the street. In 1903, Malvina's brother, Richard, fell ill and died in Chicago at the age of 29. A few years later, one of her sisters developed a fatal disease and passed away at age 32. These 2 losses prompted Malvina to make her first sculpture, Despair. Quote, the desolate figure of a woman in the grip of despair. Up to this point, Hoffman's education had been largely at the Chapin School for Girls, followed by the prestigious and demanding Brearley School. It was during her time at Brearley but Hoffman also took classes at the Women's School of Applied Design and at the Art Students League. In 1906, she studied sculpture at the Velton School under Herbert Adams and George Gray Bernard, while studying painting with John W. Alexander. In 1909, her father's failing health prompted Malvina to create a portrait of him. Finding oils and pastels inadequate, she turned to sculpture. Upon showing the bust to her father, he reportedly said, "My child, I'm afraid you're going to be an artist. Above all, you must be an artist. After that, you may create art." He died 2 weeks later. A family friend, Gutson Borglum, the Danish-American sculptor who created Mount Rushmore, suggested Malvina carve her father's bust in marble. Accepted for display at the National Academy, this was Hoffman's first publicly exhibited sculpture. The following year, Malvina, along with her mother, traveled to Europe on a $1,000 inheritance her mother received from a friend. They arrived in Naples and, after 2 months in Italy, traveled through Switzerland to Paris, where they remained for more than a year. Armed with a letter of introduction from Borglum and regards from collector Mrs. John Simpson, Malvina tried 5 times to see the great French sculptor Auguste Rodin at his studio. On her 5th attempt, she refused to be turned away and was finally allowed to see Rodin. The account of her meeting with the world-famous sculptor was recorded in detail in Hoffman's 1936 book, Heads and Tails. Although he was meeting with a group of men, he broke away to receive Malvina. Spying an envelope under her arm, he asked what was inside. When Malvina stated that it was a beginning sculpture, that she was a beginning sculptor, and inside the envelope were photographs of 2 sculptures, Rodin asked to see them. One was a photograph of the sculpture of her father, Richard Hoffman. The other was of Samuel Grimson, a violinist who played with her father and who was to eventually become Hoffman's husband from 1924 to 1936. Rodin remarked, "Character seems to interest you. You have studied these men well. One is the mature artist with his life battles behind him. The other is the young dreamer with his battles ahead of him." Rodin turned to his visitors with whom he had arranged to lunch and left Hoffman alone in his studio to examine all of his work. When he returned, Hoffman and Rodin discussed the work in the studio, and Rodin agreed to take Hoffman on as a student, working together in the same studio. And there's more, but we'll leave it at that. Here we see a photograph on the left of Rodin and Hoffman together in that period between 1910 and 1914. And on the right, we see Hoffman later in her career carving this monumental sculpture on which she is straddled to do the final cutting. So the piece that we have, Column of Life, came about really by accident. This is not the piece in question, but this is a piece from that really was the origin. You can see it's a very, very small piece. It's a small bronze, 4.5 inches in height. And this all occurred while she was a student of Hoffman. This is a later casting in 1917, but while she was a student. And in her book, she relates the genesis of the Column of Life. She says, "One incident which made a great impression upon me took place at the entrance to the Rue de Varennes studio. I was kept waiting a long time for Rodin to arrive," which was pretty common, I understand. "I took 2 small bits of clay and rolled them absent-mindedly into 2 pieces about 5 inches long. These I pressed together in my closed hand, and studying the result, I was amazed to find that the pressure of my fingers had clearly suggested the forms of 2 standing figures. I added the 2 heads and was tapping the base on the stone step to make it stand up when Rodin appeared. He asked me what I was doing, and I showed him the little group. Just an accident, I said, made while I was waiting for you. After carefully examining it from all sides, he said very seriously, there is more in this than you understand at present. An accident, you say? Well, it is one of those accidents which one must catch and transform into science. You will keep this and model this group 1/2 life size and cut it in marble. Before you do it, you must study for 5 years. Will you promise to do this? Yes, I answered, and wondered deeply how Rodin could see so clearly and decisively into the future. Eventually, I carried out the idea and called it the column of life. So here we have small bronze castings of that approximately 5-inch sculpture that she made while she was waiting for Rodin. These I found in doing research for this presentation on the internet. So there's two views here of these two figures, this male and female figure embracing. Now I found another version of this as well, also dated from 1917. So I'm not sure that these are accurate dates or if that's just a conventional date. But here also a little bit, a little bit smaller, 4¼ inches high. You can see it has a different base, not the wood base, but the actual bronze part is a little bit different from the preceding example. And the figures are a little bit more defined. So it's not quite exactly the same piece, but so you have to look for those little details that separate things from one another. Our piece, dated 1917, is the plaster. And this is a much taller piece. This is a much larger piece. This is 26½ inches tall. So it's just over 2 feet tall. It's not quite half life size, as Rodin suggested, but it is a little bit shorter than that. But this is the plaster that she created off of that original creation that she had made while she was waiting for Rodin. So here's the larger version that she did after kind of contemplating the piece for a full 5 years, basically. And you see here two embracing figures, that a male and a female, figure that are embracing, that almost become one figure, if you will, one sort of abstracted form. And there are some details in the work. Here, a different shot of it with a different camera giving it a different feel. It is much creamier, like the image on the right-hand side, in reality. But you see that there is the definition of the hands and general definition of the face, but really there's no space between these two figures. They are joined together as one. And this is where the whole idea of the column of life is coming out in the title. I have a few details here. And so should we create these plasters, and then these plasters would be used to do casts in bronze, and then the detail work would be done there. So here, and I think I have one more view of it here, not really super sharp, but you can see they're really sort of almost emerging out of the plaster itself. Oh, I'm sorry, I have one more detail here, kind of the lines, the striation. It kind of flows down behind it. It's almost as if it's sort of an extension of the woman's hair that's coming down. It was cast in bronze, and so I was able to find a number of examples of it being cast in bronze. Here from the McNay Art Museum, again, same height as our piece, 26 inches, and dating from the same date, more or less. So it's very likely that after creating the plaster in 1917, that she did create some bronzes. As I said, this one is at the McNay, gives you a sense of how it would look in the bronze. And here from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So again, you can begin to see that sort of striation. It's not really hair that's coming down, beside the two figures, they're sort of merging with the rocky outcropping that they're standing on. And here at the Art Institute, but it has a different base. If you notice here, she's done a different base. This dates from slightly later, a couple of years later, and has a different lower area there. And you can see that there's been some changes from the plaster model that we have. And this piece, the Column of Life, 1917, makes me think back to the Plaster of Despair. Now, I mentioned despair when I talked about the biography. This is the first sculpture that Malvina Hoffman created. And just like Column of Life that was to come years later, both versions, it's a very closed form. It's not one that you enter very easily. It's this is about an 11-inch piece. It's a small piece. It is like the Column of Life, also a fairly emotional piece. This is despair, and I have what Malvina Hoffman said about this work from her book Heads and Tails. And I've got a quote in here, but let me start. In 1903, Malvina Hoffman's eldest brother, Richard Hoffman, fell ill and died in Chicago at 29. She recounts, when his body was brought home and the coffin left in our front parlor, I was told I could go in and say goodbye to my beloved brother. I touched his bronze-colored hair with my fingers, leaned over and kissed his forehead. The marble-like coldness of death sent a shiver through my body, and for a long time I could not move or control the terrible pounding of my heart. Not long after, Hoffman lost an older sister, Elizabeth, at the age of 32. About the same time, a family friend who had been involved in a public scandal and committed suicide by jumping off of a tall building. Hoffman described making her first sculpture. The first figure that I ever modeled was made in the little third-floor room of our 43rd Street home. It was only about 10 inches high, but it expressed to my 16-year-old mind all that I knew of grief. The struggle I had trying to evolve an armature is unforgettable. A pencil stuck into a large wooden spool and a metal shoehorn lashed to this with twisted hairpins. On this grotesque skeleton, I formed the desolate figure of a woman in the grip of despair. And that's what we're looking at here. We are looking at that plaster model that she created with a pencil, a wooden spool, a shoehorn, and twisted hairpins upon which she put the plaster to create the armature. But when I was looking at the 1917 plaster of Column of Life, my mind wandered to this piece, this first piece, which again, like I said, is a fairly closed form. It's hard, you see it really from the exterior, you see it from around, you're not involved in the emotion. This is this female figure in the grips of despair. Column of Life is that couple in each other's grips. It's very much between those two. You can observe it, but you cannot enter it in a way. And so I saw some resonance, a similar sort of feeling. You don't find this in very many other works by Malvina Hoffman. Her career is largely one of portraiture, and you don't have, and that's a very different kind of thing. You don't have that same narrative quality that you have in these works, in Despair and in Column of Life. But of course, it's probably this work that Malvina is also thinking of when she created her Column of Life. This is Rodin's The Kiss from 1901 to 1904, a well-known work. Malvina Hoffman would certainly have known it well, and there would have been in his studio. She would have seen it. Perhaps not this particular marble from the Tate, but there would be castings of it. Here's the detail. Again, this is really about the two figures and their relationship to each other. We are observers, but we are not involved in this particular narrative. And it existed in many different bronze versions. And this is a bronze version from Rodin's studio, in the garden of Rodin's studio in Paris. And there were many such versions of this in different sizes that Malvina would have been well familiar with. Her conception, of course, of the embrace is completely different from Rodin's, which is terrific, which is great. Rodin was not necessarily interested in creating clones of himself. He wanted each artist to express things in their own terms. And what Malvina had done purely as an accident while waiting for Rodin to show up becomes, morphs into what her version looks like. But you have to recognize that this kind of embrace, male-female embrace, was already well known by the time that Malvina went to work to study under Rodin. Here's the later version. This is from 1939. It's smaller. It's only about 13 inches high. And you can see that it is very much informed by the earlier work, by the 1917 work. But it is completely different. It is very abstracted. And in some ways looks all the way back to that little plaster model, that little 5-inch plaster model that, as far as I know, no longer exists, that we saw in bronze form early on. Here, all of the details of the bodies have really been sort of erased and smoothed out. And here you can still make out figures, but if you didn't know the earlier piece, it might make it a little bit harder for you to make out what's going on in this piece. But having known the earlier piece, the relationship between the male and the female figure, the embrace, you can make out what's going on in this piece as well. And here another view of it from a different side. And here are a couple of details, but again, it doesn't have the details that the earlier version did with the hands and the facial features and that sort of thing. And it's much more abstracted, and in a way kind of reflects some movements in abstract art that she would have been aware of, as a sculptor, but most of, trying to think of so those abstracted forms you sometimes see in the work of Arp or other artists who are working in these sort of smooth forms. But one, and here, I'm sorry, here's a bronze version of it. So it was cast in bronze. This from later than our plaster. But my mind went right away to Brancusi, whose kiss you see here from 1907, 1908, where like in the Column of Life, both versions of Malvina's Column of Life, the figures are really become one. They are kind of joined together with the embrace. Of course, here the form is much simplified. It's very abstracted, not in the same way that Hoffman does it, but in Brancusi's own way. And he does this, like Hoffman, he does this again later, here in a 1916 version in limestone, again, where it becomes really one block. They are joined together as one unit, very similar to the way that Hoffman approached the subject, and different from the way Rodin did in his version of the kiss. Obviously, this still has a lot of the details in it. You make out the form, so it's very different from Hoffman's later version of the Column of Life. But it was another, I think, example of this kind of embracing couple that was present at the time that Hoffman was was studying and as she was getting started in her artistic career. And I think that is the last image I have. So I will stop sharing. And here we go. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions. These programs, these one night stands by design are supposed to be short. So I've gone even over the 20 minutes I was trying to allot myself. But I'd be happy to answer any questions about either one of these versions of the column of life that Hoffman did. Or observations that you might have. Doesn't have to be a question.
When was the last time the Hoffman was on display?
Well, that's a good question. It was before the pandemic. I can't remember the exact years, but I know we did two major shows of hers. One was with a Rodin that was on loan to us, and one was just Hoffman, all Hoffman. And I want to say the last time they probably were on view, probably 2015, 16, I would say. And I think the time before that might have been 2011. Yeah, I should mention to you that I have here somewhere in my notes, the exact number. The museum has 159 works by Malvina Hoffman, which is quite a few.
Wow.
That were donated to us in 1985 and 1986 from her nephew, Charles Lamson Hoffman, and his family. Charles Lamson Hoffman's wife, Barbara Marshall Hoffman, was one of the daughters of Francis Fiske Marshall, whose portrait was painted by Grant Wood and is owned by the museum. The Hoffman collection includes finished works, models, medallions, and the Bacchanal frieze, which is on view in the Carnegie Library wing of the museum, and two portraits of Hoffman by Edward McCartan. Malvina didn't have any children, and so her studio holdings, she had a studio in New York and in Paris, went to her nieces and nephews, and it was Charles Lamson Hoffman, who had married Isida Rapidian, who convinced his siblings to keep the collection together. Now the papers and some drawings and watercolors did go to the Getty Museum, but the sculptures that were still in her possession at the time of her death came to us. And so we are able then to, when we do shows of Malvina's work, we tend to be very comprehensive. We show things from her youth, including despair, all the way up, to her accomplished portraits that she was continuing to do into the 1960s. Now, of course, most of her work, the column of life, the second column of life that she did, was probably one of her most abstract compositions ever. And so she really was best known for doing portraits which looked like the sitters, and they were not abstracted, but they were wonderful. But that was really against the tide of 20th century modern sculpture, which tended to favor abstraction. And so by the time she died in 1966, her reputation was not as strong as it was in the 20s and 30s. And not that she was any worse an artist, she wasn't. But tastes had changed, and portraiture was not as valued or prized at the time of her death as it was earlier in her career, which is one of the reasons why I really like the column of life, in that it is so very different from her, and you really, the abstract one from the 30s is so out of character for her, and I just really enjoy those surfaces that she's created. but it is very much informed by the more naturalistic one that she did in 1917. And it's just really kind of cool that the whole thing began kind of as an accident while she was waiting for Rodin to show up. And like I said, he tended to be late frequently. In fact, when that first episode where she came and introduced herself to him and asked to be his student, he was meeting a group of men and they went to lunch and she was left in the studio. They came back 2 or 3 hours later. He had forgotten about her. And apparently the fire had gone out in the studio and it was like frigid cold in the studio. And he comes in and says, "Oh my God, I forgot about you." And so he was already kind of character at that point, but they got along famously. They were very good friends. It was a very good match. She was an excellent student. And then, I think she would have been with him longer, but of course in 1914, World War I begins. And so he trusted her. He had a show in London. She was in London at the beginning of the war. And he had a show, but he couldn't get out of France to oversee its installation. So he entrusted her to oversee the installation of the show. And they were very good friends. Now he passes away. He dies in 1917, if I remember correctly. So she did catch him at the very tail end of his life. They were able to be together in the studio for a good 4 years, but remained friends for those remaining 3 years of his life.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And it's really cool to have that Burn Koozie tie-in at the end too. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for joining. I really appreciate it. So a version of this will be put onto YouTube in about a week or so, once we get it sort of all cleaned up and translated. And then, so if you want to catch anything again that I might have said too quickly, or you want to hear it again, tune in or tell your friends to, if you liked what you saw, tell your friends to check it out on YouTube in about a week or so. But thank you for joining. We'll do it again next month. We don't have a topic yet, but we'll come up with something for you. And I appreciate you joining me this evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so
Goodbye.
much.